Hi there, fellow loom knitters. Take a look at this gorgeous texture. And it's kind of lacy too. Oh, this is the star stitch. Today, we're going to look at how to create this marvelous stitch, as well as do a simple color change. The color change is what makes those stars really pop. So you'll be able to, once we're done, you'll be able to add this to your loom knitting toolkit, and it's great for any project. This eventually, because it's a whip, this eventually will be a poncho. Now, because this is a stitch tutorial, I'm not going to discuss yarns. All of that stuff, all the details and the tools that you need will be in the description below. The star stitch. We're going to look at it in one color and see the basic stitch itself. We're going to move on to creating it in two colors because we're going to implement a color change, and that's going to make those stars pop. Then we're going to learn how to do it faster, speed. And finally, we're going to learn how to read our stitches because that always comes in handy. And after all of that, we're going to look at the star stitch in different variations. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this because just by doing a couple of tweaks to this same stitch, it moves it in a completely different direction. And of course, as usual, we're going to share a few tips and tricks along the way. So by sharing knowledge is how we level up. The good news is you can use any loom at all. As long as you coordinate the gauge of the loom with the weight of the yarn, you'll be fine. Now, when you're using any loom, you will need to mark your pegs and alternating them. So you can mark them using a bread tie, elastics, nail polish, whatever floats your boat. Doesn't matter. If you're doing this stitch in the round, this pattern takes an even number of stitches, so you'll need an even number in your circular loom. Unless you actually want to add a seam throughout the pattern, you could do that. There's an idea, make it yours. Now, I will be actually using a flexi loom, and by default, they have 2 pegs on each link. And as you can see, I've already marked my borders, so we'll be using the 2 pegs to our advantage. So let's start at the beginning. This is the basic stitch in one color. Notice the texture of the fabric. This star stitch actually does have, when you pull it apart, so I guess after blocking you can see the lattice work in there. It creates a beautiful textured fabric with little clusters that look like stars. I've added a 2 peg and 2 row border around this pattern because that makes it pop. It highlights it, it frames it very nicely. The border I chose is just a plain garter stitch border, nothing fancy. By adding the border, it means that you can cast on and bind off whichever method that you prefer. So knitter's choice. This is a 4-row pattern. Rows 1 and 3 are E-wraps because they are the loosest, most relaxed stitch there is, and that allows you the most freedom to transfer the stitches from one peg to the other. Those transfers, they will happen on rows 2 and 4, and because they're U-wraps, the pattern won't roll. So that's kind of nice, an added bonus. Those initial transfers as a right-handed person, I'm going to be making them from right to left. But if you're a left-handed person, those transfers will go from left to right. Here's a better angle for the star stitch. The 2 colors, you can see clearly the definition of the stars. It really makes them pop. Now let's actually create the star stitch in 2 different colors. Row 1. After knitting the border, I E-wrap to the other side of the loom, up to the border, and then true knit the final 2 pegs. The true knit stitch won't curl. Changing directions, now is row 2. I'll slip stitch that first stitch and purl the second stitch. So this is still the border, folks, and now this is still the first color. Here's where I use the Flexee Loom links and pegs to my advantage. I'm going to transfer the stitch from the first peg over to the second peg of the same link, leaving that first peg empty. Moving my working yarn behind the first peg and then in front of the second peg, I'm going to now transfer the yarn, that middle strand, back over to the first peg. Taking my working yarn behind and around the first peg to create a U-wrap. I'll now knit over the first peg and then knit over the second peg. Let's do it one more time, but a little quicker. Transfer the yarn from the first peg over to the second peg, working yarn behind the first peg in front of the second peg. Move the yarn back over to the first peg, working yarn in front of the first peg, knit over the first peg, knit over the second peg. Now that we know what we're doing, let's pick up the pace. We're going to create an assembly line by grouping the steps together and create a rhythm. The first thing we're going to do is knit over all the previous rows E-wrap. So that's step 1. We're going to push all the yarn down and prepare for the next step, which is transferring the yarn from the first peg over to the second peg of that same link. And we're going to do that all the way to the other end until we get to the border. Then we're going to go back to the beginning and we're going to actually create the stars. So we're doing it in 3 different steps, but by grouping them together, we can go so much faster. And here we are, finally, at the color change. It is ridiculously simple, so let's take a look. When I get to the border, I'm going to purl that first stitch, like I normally do, with that first color. But now I'm not going to work that final peg. Instead, I'm going to pick up the second color and wrap around to do a true knit on that final peg. Then, of course, I'm going to change directions and finish with the border so that I don't lose track of where I am. And I'd like to point out at this time what the edges actually look like. You'll notice how they neatly change color. They alternate between the 2 colors. And because we've done a true knit on both sides, each edge is very smooth. So it's a smooth color change from one to the other. And now we continue on with the second color, and we're going to E-wrap all the way down to the next border, and we're going to true knit that next border, as we always have. And I'd like to point out, now that it's the second color, after we've E-wrap or knit over all of our E-wraps from the previous 3rd row, we are going to move the stitches. We're going to stagger the stars. Before, on the first color, we went from the first peg to the second peg of the same link. Now we're going to go from the second peg to the first peg on the next link. So we're going to bridge the gap between the 2 links. And in doing so, now all of our stars are that's where the lattice work comes in. We also have the option of putting a star inside the border if we wanted. I've chosen to only do it on one side, and you can see where I've worked ahead and processed that at the other end, but for the first end I haven't done anything, and I'm going to just ignore that stitch. That is actually knitter's choice, so you can decide what to do. So now that I've moved all of the stitches over, I've transferred the stitches from the second peg to the first peg, I am just going to create all the stars to the border on the other side. So there you go. And now you can take a look and see how the stars do stagger and they are on like a diagonal, and it creates that lattice work when you pull it apart. And just a tip, I don't know if you noticed, but the first color I started on the first peg, and the second color I started on the second peg. So my stars shifted from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 1. It was just a trick that I used to help me remember things. And with that speed hack, shifting the same stitch just over by 1, hey, you can knit the star stitch like a pro too, and watch the yarn dance across your pegs. Experience has taught me that the best time to put your knitting down, put the project down, is midway through an even row. So a row that you're creating the stars on. Ideally, you're going to have transferred a few of your stitches over and actually completed a few of the stars. That way, when you pick it up again, you'll know what you've done, where you are, and what you're going to do next. Now, that's in a perfect world. And ideal doesn't always happen because life gets in the way. So, this is where reading your knitting will really come in handy. So let's learn how to read the stars. We're going to look for the clusters of yarn. The last row, we're going to put our yarn pick between the pegs to find out where the clusters are. Are they between pegs 1 and 2, or are they between pegs 2 and 1? By flipping it over, we can see this one is between 1 and 2. Therefore, the next cluster is going to be between 2 and 1. Now that you know where you've been, we can confidently move forward, no second guessing. And as I was creating the swatches, I thought, okay, this was the basic one. Then by adding a second color, it created such a difference in the look of it. I thought, holy cow. I started getting curious. What happens if I changed it around a little bit? So the first thing I did was I added a second E-wrap row. So now my stars are farther apart. You can still see and make out the lattice work in there, but it's also a much more relaxed and looser fabric because I've added an extra row. Now, by adding that extra row, the curse quotient went up because the challenge I encountered was now instead of dealing with even numbers, I was dealing with odd numbers, which meant that I had to learn how to make my stars going in the other direction. So it was counterintuitive for me. I actually had to create my stars from the left over to the right. Then it occurred to me that instead of adding a second E-wrap row, what if I were to create a purl row? So now I would have a purl row framing my stars within the pattern. And I thought, oh, well, that'd be kind of cool. That only occurred to me like 10 minutes ago, so there is no swatch showing that. Sorry. Another thing that I was looking at, another variation that I created, was I thought, what if I lined all the stars up? There's a joke in there somewhere. And what would that look like? So I created that pattern, and as you can see, it's like a textured rib, which I thought that was kind of cool. So you've lost the lattice work, but the ribbing has really taken on a texture. And I suspect that something like this would look really cool in like a chunky yarn. So just putting it out there. So those were the variations that I thought of. Perhaps you can think of a few more. Let me know in the comments below what was your favorite variation. Wow, we sure did cover a lot today. Let's do a quick recap. First of all, we learned how to create the star stitch. Then we learned an easy color change just by carrying the yarn up the loom. We avoided weaving in those ends. By grouping the different steps together, our yarn just danced across the pegs. Afterwards, we learned how to read our stitches, read our stars, if you will. Plus, we looked at a whole bunch of variations. Most of the swatches were created and some we had to imagine. And let's not forget all those tips and tricks that we threw in for good measure. And if you caught me using that trick with the pen tube, that's also a speed hack. And if you want to know exactly how it's done, click on the video here. Or you can click on the playlist and find out how to do more cool techniques. And remember, this is where we level up, right here. So if you learned something new or found this video helpful, by all means, like and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on those notifications. That way you'll never miss a new tip, trick, or technique. So until next time, I'm Stacey from Stitches by Stacey. Thanks for watching.